English language. We've all had anew of your making it too for us to pronoanque. Have you guys seen this video? I will link to it in the description. This guy sings a whole song about how abominably difficult it is to pronounce the English language. And I almost said to learn the rules of pronunciation for the English language, but it might be doing language learners a disservice to call them rules, because one feature of our, I think, beautifully various grab bag of a language is you end up with a bunch of different spellings and a bunch of different ways to spell the same sound, a bunch of different words that have the same group of letters but not the same sounds, different grammatical rules that come from various sources. And we've talked about this a lot in the history of the English language. I have heard from you guys that you're really interested in this part of our Words series, where I talk about the language you technically already speak, but maybe there's a bunch of stuff in here that you didn't know about. It's kind of like rummaging around in a room of your home, maybe the attic, and discovering all this awesome memorabilia from like 5 generations back. That's what studying English can be a little bit like. And I'll post this video of a guy that made a song about how why do we have a bunch of other letters in the word Q that we don't pronounce? The first letter is Q, so as he says, what's with the extra way? And why is the plural of mouse mice, but not the plural of house heis? These are all questions that came back to me as I was answering last week the question about handwriting. And that got me thinking about written language more generally a little bit. And as I started to talk about this, but there's more to say, so I wanted to do one more episode on the visual component of language, which is a whole other axis of translation. We've been talking a lot about translation between different languages, which I've been talking about kind of on a horizontal axis. I did some talk about register, which is the formality or the milieu of a particular word, the difference between dog and hound, and I was thinking about that kind of as like the vertical axis of translation. Now, if you want to add a z-axis or something, this is the art of taking what is effectively a sound, a word first and foremost when it emerges from the human mind is a sound, and then translating that sound into the visual art of writing, which is very ancient, as I talked about last week, but also not entirely natural in the sense that it occurs to anybody who just rolls out of his mother's womb to start writing things down. Aristotle makes this point already early on when he says our sounds that we make are basically symbols of our thoughts or our inward experiences, our pathemata, and then our written words are basically symbols of our spoken words. So you have this chain basically of symbolism, and I think it is a more and more physicalized chain in some ways, because the sound of the word still kind of connects in your mind to the thought of the word. The visual symbol of the word starts to, of course, if you can read, it looks like the word, but the letters themselves have less and less connection in our alphabet, in our written language, to the concept. It's not like words tend to look like what they mean. And as we will get into discussing today, that's a development in the history of our language and in the history of written language generally. Of course, there are written languages that have a more natural, mimetic connection to the concepts that they denote. For example, Chinese characters, which famously are based on these little pictograms. And it's possible, it's not demonstrably true, but it seems quite likely that most writing begins with pictograms, that when written systems first emerge, they are gradually shaped out of pictograms and little pictures of things. For a long time, people thought that's how hieroglyphics worked, since the characters of hieroglyphics are pictures of things, and they were sometimes used in a pictographic fashion. But also, it became clear when the Rosetta Stone emerged and people started to uncover how the Egyptian language rather, was actually written, it became clear that these visual images had gradually become detached from the things of which they were pictures and started to mean sounds, started to represent the spoken language more directly. And this is where you start to get what really qualifies as an alphabet. So we are looking here at a chain of transmission from thought, which has no sound or symbol or image. It doesn't look like anything. A thought doesn't have a color. It doesn't have a shape. Then we move on to this series of words, things that we do with our mouth, sounds that we make. And from there, we move on to putting those sounds, connecting them to images, physical drawings and representations. And those drawings tend, they don't always, but they tend to move in an increasing direction of abstraction as the symbol gets more and more distant from its original object, from any resemblance to its original object. And that is something that has happened to a high degree in English, so that once you make that disconnect, you can start to see how the written symbols, even though they are attached to the sounds, and even though the sounds are attached to the thoughts, they're loosely enough attached that the word through is pronounced differently than the word enough, even though they both involve O-U-G-H, which is what the song is playing on when you say, we've had a new of you're making it two for us to pronounce, right? That's the reason you can make that joke is because in the process of moving from pure thought, pure experience into communicable sounds and then into written symbols, we move in this chain of abstraction away from the immediacy of the experience, which is the most, in some sense, real or basic or natural thing that we're communicating, the experience of being a conscious entity, but which is also totally incommunicable. So the more close you get to the raw experience, the less communicable it becomes, the less technologically skillful we can be about getting that across, the further away we move in a direction of abstraction, away from that inner experience, the more we're able to communicate. So the language of transmission or the mechanisms of transmission take us further and further away from the original experience, but the trade-off that we make then is that they become more and more spreadable. We can scale them out into these larger and larger media. And for most of human history, this was true of the written word, that it was way more scalable than speech, which you could only do for so far as your voice would carry. If you wanted to get that further out there, you had to move one step down the chain of abstraction and distance from the original thing into the written word. This creates, and here we are at a place where the study of language just is the study of the human predicament, because we can learn from this about more than just written words. This creates the potential and the danger of idolatry. Idolatry is a word I've used before on this podcast, and it's a word that the minute you say it gets connected to various people's theology. Whatever you may think about idols, like the statues of Baal that they used to carve in the temples, or maybe money is an idol for you, or maybe sex becomes an idol. And all these things are idols. But in themselves, as examples, they don't really get at the heart of what binds all idols together and what shapes our Christian and Jewish idea of idolatry, this practice or this habit, even this tendency of making idols. And through the chain of abstraction that I've just been describing, we can maybe start to see what idolatry itself, idolatry proper is, which is when you move so far away from the spirit of the thing in an effort to communicate that you lose sight of the original spirit, the underlying impetus, and you just have the symbols and the letters, and they get detached from their underlying meaning. This is why Paul says, the letter killeth, but the spirit giveth life. He's talking about idolatry. He's talking about how when we create symbols, we inevitably have to attach physical embodiments to immaterial spiritual things, and then begins the process of creating space and distance between the symbol and the symbolized, the physical thing and the thing that it stands in for. And in that space, we're able to abuse the symbol and treat it as if it were the thing itself. So when sex becomes an idol, for example, what you're saying is, sex is a mode of communicating the good. Sex is a way of communicating love between two people. And out of that goodness, that ineffable spiritual connection, there naturally arises pleasure and delight and all the physical sensations that come along with sex. But it's possible to detach that physical embodiment of love and just get the physical pleasure, just get the material good, and gradually sex becomes more important than the love that it's supposed to communicate, and you get a whole host of nasties. You get sadism and filth and all this stuff that we see when sex becomes detached from its roots in love. Another example would be money. When you make an idol out of money, you have confused the physical object, the paper or the number in your bank account, for the thing that it represents, which is the goods that you're able to buy, the good that you're able to do with it, the food that sustains your life, the house that keeps your family safe, all of the things that the money stands in for and represents. You've made an idol out of money. Language, because it is the most essentially human activity, is also kind of the distilled example of this habit that we have, which is both our greatest strength and our potentially greatest weakness, this habit of embodying the spirit in flesh. And the written word is even more sort of separated from the spirit of communication that we were able to embody more fully when we're face-to-face and talking to one another. So it's very easy to twist, to quote out of context, to misrepresent the word when you take the letters away from their original meanings and their original intention. I read this wonderful quote the other day, not from a source that I'm particularly fond of, and that's the Encyclopédie, a giant project spearheaded by Denis Diderot, who was one of the philosophes of the French Enlightenment. So I have a lot of criticisms, problems with the French Enlightenment, and even with the Enlightenment more generally. It tended, I think, to be a project of idolatry. Detaching reason was the thing that it idolized, the process of human discernment and logic, detaching it from the fundamental core truths that were supposed to be its groundwork and its foundation, and turning reason itself, the process of reasoning, into an absolute good, detached from that underlying spirit. And then you end up with rationalism and the cold heartlessness of the later Enlightenment, and I think on into our present day. I digress a little bit, only to say that doesn't mean there weren't some good things that came out of the Enlightenment, even the French Enlightenment. Yes, I even have something good to say about French people in this episode, and that is to quote this guy Nicolas Beauzée in his article on grammar from the Encyclopédie, which is this voluminous compendium, again, spearheaded by Diderot. And Beauzée says, I will read it in French, since we're talking about translation, and because French is just a gorgeous language, I'm forced to concede. He says, La parole est une sorte de tableau dont la pensée est l'original. And when I quoted this on Twitter, I translated it as a word is a kind of painting whose subject is a thought. And that's basically true, but this is a neat illustration of the challenges, the pitfalls of translation, that a word is not quite what Beauzée is talking about here. He really means language. La parole is language, but it's the practical act of language. It's something in between our word language and our word. La parole means the written word, or the spoken word is kind of the closest thing we could get to it. So words are paintings, tableaux, and their original, that is their subject, the model that you're painting with your words is thought. I've used, on this series before, I've used the metaphor of clothing and the body, that thought is the body, and we're trying to cut clothes for the body, but no bolt of fabric quite fits or lays exactly along the contours, which is why translation always involves a certain degree of trade-off. And if that's true, if Beauzée is right that we're painting a painting of a thought with our language, then with our written language, we're sort of painting a painting of our painting of the thought. And there is, if you can believe it, a French term for this, which is very useful, and you can take this away to the bank. It's called a mise en abîme, which is when you have a painting of a painting of a painting of a painting, or a story about a story about a story about a story, and so forth. And that's kind of what we're dealing with, I think, when we deal with written language. And like all potential idols, like all symbol systems, written language can take on a logic of its own internal to the symbol system that loses its connection to the thought system. And by the way, it's almost inevitable that this will happen. It's particularly stark in English because we have so many different forms of speech and so many different dialects that had to be standardized at one point in the early modern period. But it's true everywhere. And it's true also if you watch the process that creates the alphabet that we now work with. So to lay out a few useful terms here as we're thinking about writing systems, I mentioned that what we have is an alphabet, which is in some ways the most fully developed version of a writing system. Doesn't mean it's the best or the most effective for every purpose, but an alphabet, strictly speaking, is a system in which every sound has a symbol, or all the primary sounds have symbols, both consonants and vowels. And that's the important distinction. So A, E, I, O, U have their own letters in our alphabet, and B, C, D, etc. also have their own letters. And it's not that every letter only has one sound, or that there aren't sounds you can make which require more than one letter, but it's that consonants and vowels are fully fleshed out and fully written out. And that is actually why it's called an alphabet, because it stands in for the Greek letters alpha and beta, the first two letters of the alphabet. Alpha is a vowel, beta is a consonant. The Hebrew version, by the way, is called the Aleph-bet, because they don't use alpha, they use Aleph. So that's what we are working with. And it is a sort of a late addition to the storehouse of writing technologies. If you think of pictograms as kind of the origin of this whole thing, then as these systems tend to develop, they only gradually come toward what will be an alphabet. An alphabet is actually, if you can believe it, kind of the clearest way to write, because it leaves very little to the imagination once you know some of the rules and tendencies of how to pronounce things. One step further back from that is what's called a syllabary. And syllabaries still have a symbol for all of the primary sounds, but they combine the vowel and the consonant. And each vowel-consonant pair has its own symbol that's represented as one thing. Now, the classic example of this would be Japanese. So Japanese does pick up the Chinese characters, and it's called kanji in Japanese, but there are also two other writing systems, the hiragana and katakana, and each of those writing systems is a syllabary because each each symbol represents a consonant plus a vowel. So you have sa, or ma, or li, and so on and so forth. And they aren't graphically representing which vowel or which consonant they're associated with. So some of the consonant pairings have similar shapes, but in general, ki and ri or li don't really necessarily look the same just because they're both the I shape of the letter. So that's a syllabary, and I say that to distinguish it from, this is a really good one, an abugida. And an abugida is where you have characters that represent, again, a vowel and a consonant pairing, but they're kind of twined together, so there's a part of it that you can see that represents the vowel itself, and then you manipulate those characters to create different vowel pairings. And this is, the classic example here would be Devanagari, which is the symbols that you've probably seen used to write Sanskrit and a lot of Indian languages. That's an abugida as compared to the syllabary. Then you have finally the abjad, which is where you don't represent, or you don't have to represent the vowels at all, although you can add them in with the diacritical marks. And the example here would be Hebrew or Arabic, where you can write it without any vowels at all, or you can write the little dots in. And those dots, or those extra sort of decorative marks, are not actually strictly decorative. They're called diacritics, and what they do is they add in more information that you don't really need to be able to read the language. Behind all of this, one step further back, is just pictures of things, and then pictures will gradually evolve into pictographs and the kinds of writing systems that we get in, for example, Chinese characters. Probably all the alphabets that we typically know about and think about in the West come from a distant set of pictographic symbols. And certainly they come from the Phoenician alphabet, which may have pictographs in its background, but which does evolve into an alphabet, or at least an abjad, pretty early on. And then it gives rise, because the Phoenicians were traders and travelers, it gives rise to a bunch of different alphabets that might not instantly be apparently connected to one another. So there's the Greek alphabet, which is connected to Phoenician. There's also, from Greek, you get the Old Italic alphabet, and from there you go to the Latin alphabet. So that strand connects Latin as well, and those symbols to Phoenician. Hebrew is also derived from Phoenician, so is Arabic. And the way you can tell that this is true is that those alphabets all tend to chunk up the sound spectrum in roughly the same way. So what do I mean by that? Well, each letter or each symbol of an alphabet is going to take one form of the mouth, or one sort of region of sound that you're able to make, and staple it, chunk it into a particular slot. And so the fact, for example, that all of these alphabets that I've just mentioned have a character that stands in for B, it's not that only Phoenician-related characters, alphabets, have a B character, but it's not guaranteed that you would have to have a B as distinct from, say, a V or a D. You might have one that kind of groups the sounds in a different sort of way, but because we have this common ancestor of the Phoenician alphabet, we kind of group all of our sounds in roughly the same way across the spectrum. Now, you will notice that in that list, that sort of family tree list of Phoenician alphabet-inspired writing systems, I did not mention English, because English, as always, remains a bit of a weirdo due to the fact that it takes place, it comes into being on this island. And so you get influences that are connected to the influence in the rest of Europe, but you don't get them instantaneously along with all the other developments on the continent of Europe. And in fact, in England, before the introduction of the Latin script, which again has this distant root of the Phoenician and that connects it to all the other alphabets that we know of, before you get the Latin script, you have another system of writing altogether called Futhorc. And this is an Anglo-Saxon writing system that it basically looks like runes. You've probably seen it. It's the scratched runes that people write when they want to look like druidic and cool. And gradually, as Christian missionaries come to the English Isles and they start to convert the Anglo-Saxons, they begin to replace this other runic writing system with the alphabet that the Latins have used, which is now the alphabet that the Western Church is using. And all of this, by the way, is before the Normans come. So before 1066, it's part of the missionary system that is started with Gregory the Great back in the day. And so over the course of basically the 7th century AD and shortly afterward, so a few centuries on from that mission that Gregory sends, you start to get the replacement of this other writing system with this Phoenician-inspired Latin writing system, which therefore is not necessarily directly cut. It's not a template that's perfectly cut to fit the sound spectrum and the series of sounds that English is gradually evolving to offer. And from that moment, you get this kind of double vision, or this palimpsest, if you like, of the Latinate writing system imposed onto the Anglo-Saxon sound spectrum. And there are some letters that endure from the older writing system, from Futhorc, and stay on and can still be seen in some Anglo-Saxon texts. The most famous of this is the letters meaning th, or th. Our th sound is not one that we find readily available in the Latin alphabet. We do find it represented in the Greek alphabet with the letter theta, although that was probably more of an aspirated t than our full-on th sound. And so this is a classic example of a wrinkle that emerges between the underlying contours and the clothing that you're trying to layer over it. And we have all these letters in Old English that express that th sound that then eventually have to die out and be replaced by the th symbol. So we have the thorn, which kind of looks like a P with a long line rather than a line that just goes straight down. We have the letter F, which is a D with a line through it. And we have another letter that is important for our story, although not a th sound. It's more of the h sound, the guttural sound that we get with yoh. There are others that endure in the early English alphabet, but these are kind of our important ones, especially because this helps us to realize that the letter th, or the thorn letter that spells th, eventually gets preserved in a form that looks a lot like a Y. And this is why when you see things that say ye olde or whatever, you shouldn't pronounce them as I just did, as ye olde. Ye olde in those old-timey signs actually is the old. It's just that we had all of these th sounds that had to be gradually assimilated to this new writing system as the underlying language was kind of fit to this foreign cloth, essentially. And this is kind of illuminating, I think. It tells us, for example, why sounds like through and enough and these GH sounds get kind of jawboned into different, commandeered, let's say. They get commissioned into different work. The letters OUGH and GH especially can get kind of repurposed in a variety of different ways for sounds that used to have more natural symbols associated with them in our older writing systems. All of this is going to get standardized because it has to, and this is part of the story that I've told before, that as the nations of Europe start to centralize power and control, they need to agree upon different ways of speaking, they need to agree that all the different ways of speaking are going to be standardized into one. Under the English monarchy, this is particularly part of the incorporation of the different dialects into one, and the printing press of Caxton and all the developments that I've talked about before. But in the case of writing, this really gets going under the rule of King Charlemagne. And we still use the term the Carolingian minuscule. So this is the 700s now, when Charlemagne has this wonderful scholar, Alcuin of York, over to his court to sort of figure out how we're all going to get on the same page about writing, so to speak. And so our script evolves gradually out of this minuscule, which is to say the lowercase letters of this writing system that was developed under Charlemagne. And so anytime you write your name, you are basically making use of a technology that was honed over centuries, but also stitched together from kind of a patchwork quilt of a variety of different things. And what I want to convey to you in no uncertain terms throughout this whole series is that no such patchwork is perfect. In fact, we are kind of inclined to confuse the patchwork and the clothing for the underlying body because we are inherently idolatrous, because the human heart is a factory of idols. So without thinking about these language issues, we're inclined to just assume that the world is just broken up into the boxes that our own language creates and provides for us. But the more we study other languages, the more we realize that actually every language is kind of a patch-up job. It's kind of an ad hoc collection of different syllables and ideas that chunk up reality in different ways. And written languages are just an ad hoc series of symbols and pictures and images that chunk up the sound spectrum. The different kinds of sounds I'm capable of making with my mouth get chunked up into particular symbols so that we can effectively represent the symbols that we are then using to effectively represent the thought. Painting of a painting of a painting. Mise en abîme. And we're always doing this, and we're always coming up against things like enough and through, where the seams in the patchwork become apparent. And what this reveals is that no human thought, no one human expression, no human mode of interacting can exhaustively categorize the world. And this is a very profound truth that you start to learn as you study the different attempts people have made to create systems of thought and systems, therefore, of logic and of writing that fully categorize the world. And you start to end up with questions like, well, if I were building a perfect language, would I start with nouns and with things, or would I start with verbs? Which of those is more primary? Primary actions that can then get modified to represent things, or primary things that can get modified to represent actions? And you can approach these things from any possible angle, and you're always going to end up with creases in the fabric. So for example, let's say that you invented a language that just started with primary actions like doing and running, runner, man, right? And gradually you can start to develop these concepts out of the action. So one who does becomes a doer, one who speaks becomes a speaker, one who drinks becomes a drinker. But how do you get at the concept, for example, there of man or cat, right? So there's your wrinkle. You're going to have to do this really roundabout way of getting at other primary concepts. Let's say you just start with nouns, right? And you say, okay, so I'm going to nail my language to man, cat, chair, dog, these entities and objects. Well, now how do you say do, right? How do you communicate certain primary actions? You can't say thing that man acts on because there are other things that do stuff besides humanity. So I'm gesturing here, but you get the idea that all of these systems we use are clothings or tablecloths that we layer over this complex contour, and the contour itself is the thing that we're trying to get at, and it is the thing that we have access to through our minds, through our consciousness. But we can never fully express it, at least in this life, in a perfectly embodied way. And this is actually a good thing because it means that there is an endless store of reality for us to draw from as we embody our perceptions and our experiences in the world. Each new consciousness that God creates the world anew. And I bet you never thought you would learn that through talking about handwriting. Okay. I really just love doing these episodes. I hope you do too. I'm going to make one more plug here for my book, Light of the Mind, Light of the World, which treats some of these issues on the science level, from the science perspective. I've just dropped a new cover for the book. It's coming out October 1st. I really think you'll love it. Pre-order that in the description. And as always, don't forget to write in with your questions. I've got a bunch of questions now about language, and I think the next thing I'll probably do is one about made-up languages, but if you've got more translation questions, I welcome them. Please keep them coming. The best way to get in touch with me is to DM or email me via my Substack at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. All right, that was fun. I hope you enjoyed. I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.